Have you ever wondered what Jesus actually ate, what the streets he walked smelled like, or what concerns he shared with his neighbors in Galilee? Beyond the white robes and ancient paintings, there existed a vibrant, harsh, and fascinating world. In this biblical documentary, we set aside metaphors to dive into historical reality. This was daily life for Jesus 2,000 years ago. From fishing days on the Sea of Galilee to the architecture of mud brick houses, join us as we discover the real context that shaped the most influential message in history. Have you ever wondered if the place where Jesus grew up was truly that idyllic, silent village disconnected from the world that we usually see in Renaissance paintings, or if, on the contrary, it was a strategic point surrounded by luxury, politics, and social tensions? To understand Jesus, we cannot simply look at the sky. We have to look at the ground he trod, the stones he carved, and the cities that rose on the horizon of his youth. In this section, we are going to immerse ourselves in the urban and rural environment of first-century Galilee, a setting far more complex and fascinating than what we've been told. Imagine we are standing on a hilltop in Nazareth. Today it is a vibrant city, but 2,000 years ago it was little more than a hamlet. However, if you walked just 6 kilometers northwest, you would encounter something that would shatter all your preconceptions: Sepphoris. From the hills of Nazareth, the young Jesus could see the wooden cranes, the scaffolding, and the gleaming marble of a metropolis that Herod Antipas was rebuilding to become the jewel of Galilee. This duality between the humble village and the Roman city is the key to understanding the world in which he moved. Let's start with Nazareth. Modern archaeology tells us that no more than 200 or 300 people lived there. They were extended families who shared not only blood but also living space. Don't think of houses with gardens and fences. Think of what archaeologists call the insula. It was a complex of dwellings arranged around a shared central courtyard. Life happened in that courtyard. That is where grain was ground, bread was baked in communal ovens, and clothes were washed. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. The walls were made of local limestone, joined with mud and straw, and the roofs were flat, made of wooden beams crossed with branches and a thick layer of packed earth. Why is the detail of the roof important? Remember that story in the Gospels where men lower a paralytic through the roof to see Jesus? We often imagine they broke ceramic tiles, but in rural Galilee, that was unthinkable. What they did was dig through the mud and branches. It was a noisy, dirty job, which adds a layer of realism and desperation to the scene that we sometimes lose in translation. Those roofs also served for drying figs, sleeping on the hottest summer nights, and praying in silence. Now, let's head down from the village and look toward Sepphoris. The difference was brutal. While in Nazareth you walked on dirt and stones, in Sepphoris you could walk on carved stone pavements and see detailed mosaics representing scenes from Greek mythology. This city was a Roman administrative center. It had a theater with a capacity for thousands, Roman-style public baths, and a market bustling with products from across the empire. This is where one of the most interesting theories for current historians arises. Since Nazareth was so small, where did craftsmen like Jesus and his father Joseph work? Most likely, they walked to Sepphoris every morning. There was constant work there. The reconstruction of the city demanded stonemasons, carpenters, and builders. This means Jesus was not isolated in a purely agricultural environment. He was exposed to cultural diversity, the luxury of the empire, and the rawest face of Roman occupation from a very young age. This tension between the rural and the urban set the rhythm of life. In the villages, time was dictated by the sun and the seasons. In the city, time was dictated by power. Galilee was an incredibly fertile region, but that fertility was both a blessing and a curse. The valleys were rich in grain, and the hillsides were covered in olive groves. But much of that land did not belong to the peasants who worked it, but to great landowners who lived in the cities or even in Jerusalem. This created an atmosphere of social resentment. The peasant saw how the fruit of his sweat ended up in the warehouses of the urban elite or in Herod's coffers through suffocating taxes. Let's talk about the logistics of a typical house in Galilee. Upon entering a dwelling in Nazareth, the first thing you would notice would be the darkness. Windows were minimal to keep the house cool in summer and warm in winter. The main room was multifunctional. During the day, domestic chores were performed. At night, mats were spread on the floor for sleeping. In many cases, the most valuable animals, like a goat or a donkey, slept in a lower section of the same house to protect them from theft, and so their body heat would help warm the room. This gives us a new perspective on the manger. The manger was not necessarily in a wooden stable far from the house, but was likely a hollow carved into the rock or a stone structure inside the same area where the family lived. Archaeology at sites like Capernaum has shown us that these houses were not isolated structures. They were connected by narrow, winding alleys. This fostered a culture of extreme community but also social surveillance. Everyone knew what their neighbor was cooking and who was entering or leaving each house. In this context, honor and shame were the currencies of exchange. Your reputation was not a private matter, it was the heritage of your entire family. If one family member failed, everyone carried the stain. And how did people move between these places? There were no paved roads in rural areas, only paths worn down by the passage of animals and people. However, Rome had begun to lay its famous roads on the main routes. Galilee was a mandatory crossing point for caravans traveling from Damascus to Egypt. Jesus did not grow up in a forgotten corner of the world. He grew up in an international corridor. In the markets of nearby cities, you could hear merchants speaking Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and local dialects. This commercial effervescence brought new ideas, news from distant lands, and, of course, the constant presence of Roman soldiers, whose camps and patrols were a daily reminder of who held absolute control. Another fundamental aspect of the urban environment was the fortifications. Cities like Tiberias, built by Herod Antipas in honor of Emperor Tiberius, were symbols of power. Tiberias was a city built over a cemetery, which made it ritually impure for many strict Jews of the time. This shows us the religious fractures that existed. While some adapted to Roman modernity, others retreated to the villages to preserve the purity of their traditions. Jesus grew up right in the middle of that clash of civilizations. Water management was the heart of survival. In the villages, they depended on communal wells and the collection of rainwater in cisterns carved into the limestone. Going to the well was not just a chore, it was the social event of the day for women, the place where news was exchanged and social alliances were woven. In contrast, in Roman cities like Sepphoris, aqueducts and sewage systems, true marvels of engineering were already appearing. Seeing that technological difference must have been striking for any mountain dweller. To understand the retention of this video, we must realize that the geography of Galilee is not just a map, it is a narrative tool. The mountains offered refuge to rebels and zealots who opposed Rome, while the valleys and lockshores were zones of trade and control. The Sea of Galilee, which is actually a freshwater lake, acted as the region's economic engine. Coastal cities like Magdala were not just fishing ports, but industrial centers where fish was processed for export throughout the Mediterranean. Imagine the smell of salt, fermented fish, and the constant noise on the docks. That was the real world, a world of hard work, calloused hands, and a constant struggle for subsistence. At the end of this block, it becomes clear that daily life in Galilee was not a static postcard. It was a dynamic ecosystem where the old and the new constantly clashed. The rural environment of Nazareth provided values, faith, and language, while the urban environment of Sepphoris and Tiberias provided the political and economic context and exposure to the Gentile world. Jesus was not a desert hermit. He was someone who knew the weight of stone, the value of a lost coin on the floor of a dark house, and the structure of the cities that governed his land. This contrast is what makes his story so human and so anchored in reality. We cannot understand his words if we do not understand the streets he walked, the houses where he sat to eat, and the shadow of Roman buildings cast over his own village. Galilee was a melting pot of cultures, a place of tension and hope, and it is precisely in that setting where daily life became extraordinary. How was hygiene maintained in houses without running water, or what exactly did they eat to survive such grueling workdays? That is precisely what we are going to explore in the next section, where we will sit at the table of a Galilean family to discover that their diet and food rituals tell us much more than we imagine about how they understood the world. Before moving on, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way you'll always be up to date with our upcoming videos. Now, let's continue. Have you ever stopped to think if the carpenter label we have placed on Jesus for centuries is actually an oversimplification that prevents us from seeing the true hardship and diversity of his trade and that of his neighbors in first-century Galilee? The idea of a cozy workshop with wood shavings on the floor and the smell of pine is a romantic image, but the economic reality for a worker at that time was much cruder, more physical, and multifaceted. In this section, we are going to dive into calloused hands, sweat under the scorching sun, and the complex tax system that dictated who ate and who went hungry in the hills of Galilee. To understand the economy of 2,000 years ago, we have to erase the idea of extreme specialization from our minds. Today you are an electrician, an accountant, or a designer. In rural Galilee, you were whatever the season and necessity dictated. The Greek term used in ancient texts to describe the trade of Jesus and Joseph is Tekton. For a long time, it was simply translated as carpenter, but for an inhabitant of the Mediterranean basin, a Tekton was a construction craftsman in a much broader sense. In a region where wood was a valuable and often scarce resource, most structures were built with stone. A Tekton was someone who knew how to carve limestone, fit blocks without mortar, raise load-bearing walls, and, of course, craft the yoke for oxen or the plow for the field. Being a craftsman meant being a man of strength, someone who transported heavy materials up steep paths and spent his days in quarries or on the scaffolding of the new cities sprouting like mushrooms under the rule of Herod Antipas. Imagine the workday. There were no unions, no 8-hour schedules, no safety helmets. The day began with the first light of dawn. If Jesus and his family worked on the reconstruction of Sepphoris, as many current historians suggest, they would have to walk an hour and a half each way every day. The work was exhausting. Carving limestone under the Galilean sun generates a fine dust that sticks to the skin and fills the lungs. The tools were iron and bronze, chisels, mallets, squares, and plumb lines. Every inch of carved stone represented hours of real physical effort. This is the economy of raw effort. When Jesus spoke in his parables about building a house on rock or the weight of a yoke, he wasn't using abstract poetic metaphors. He was talking about his day-to-day life, the fatigue he felt in his own shoulders at the end of the day. But craftsmanship was not the only engine of Galilee. If we move a few kilometers east, we reach the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and here the economy changes radically. The lake was not just a picturesque place, it was an open-air money and food factory. Fishing was a massive and highly organized industry. Don't think of a solitary fisherman with a rod. Think of family cooperatives, like that of the sons of Zebedee, who owned boats and expensive nets and hired day laborers. There were 3 main techniques: the cast net, which required impressive physical skill to fall in a perfect circle over a school of fish, the dragnet, which needed 2 boats and a lot of coordination, and the trammel net. The most fascinating thing about the fishing economy was what happened after taking the fish out of the water. Fresh fish didn't last long in the heat of Israel, so the true wealth lay in processing. In the city of Magdala, whose name means tower, was the region's largest salting industry. There, the fish was cleaned, salted, and transformed into a paste called garum, a Roman delicacy exported throughout the empire. This means that the fishermen of Galilee were connected to Rome's global economy. However, access to the water was not free. The Roman state and Herod's representatives sold fishing rights. You had to pay for the permit to cast your net, you had to pay a percentage of what you caught, and you had to pay taxes on the processed product. The feeling of being suffocated by the system was constant. This brings us to the third pillar of the Galilean economy: subsistence agriculture. The vast majority of the population lived off what the land gave them, but the system of ownership was changing drastically. In ancient times, families owned their own plot of land, their inheritance. But in the 1st century, due to debt and fiscal pressure, many peasants were losing their lands to great landowners living in the cities. This created a social class of day laborers, men who stood in the village square every morning hoping someone would hire them for a denarius a day. A denarius was the minimum wage for survival, it barely enough to feed a small family for 24 hours. If you weren't hired, your family didn't eat dinner. This precariousness is what gives so much weight to the petitions for daily bread in the prayers of the time. The agricultural cycle marked the religious and social calendar. Wheat and barley were sown in winter and harvested in spring. Summer was for fruits, and autumn for grapes and olives. Olive oil was the liquid gold of Galilee. Not only was it used for cooking, but it was also the fuel for lamps, the base for medicines and hygiene products, and one of the main export products. The oil press, or Gethsemane, was a vital piece of engineering in every village. These were massive circular stones that crushed olives under enormous pressure to extract virgin oil. Again, we see how the daily language of work filtered into spirituality. The idea of being pressed by the trials of life had an immediate visual reference in the village oil press. Let's talk now about the giant elephant in the room, the tax system. If you wonder why there was so much social discontent, the answer lies with the tax collectors. The Roman system worked through tax farming. The state would say, "We need 1,000,000 denarii from this region." A contractor would pay that sum up front and then have the legal right to charge people whatever he wanted to recoup his investment and make a profit. These publicans set up their booths at river fords, city gates, and ports. They charged for the number of wheels on your cart, the number of animals you took to market, and the grain you transported. It was a system designed for corruption and abuse. A peasant might see 30 or 40% of his production disappear between religious taxes for the temple in Jerusalem and civil taxes for Caesar and Herod. This economic pressure generated a massive gap. On one hand, you saw the luxury of Roman villas with their mosaic floors and running water fountains. On the other, you saw widows who had only 2 lepta, the smallest copper coins, to offer at the temple. The coin itself was a political message. When you pulled a denarius from your bag, you saw the emperor's face and an inscription proclaiming him divine. For an observant Jew, holding that coin in his hand was already an ethical and religious conflict. Economics was not something separate from faith. They were 2 sides of the same coin, literally. The market was the heart of social interaction. It wasn't just a place to buy, but a news center. There, people found out if there was a revolt in Jerusalem, if the price of grain had risen in Egypt, or if a new preacher was speaking on the lakeshore. Haggling was an art and a necessity. Silver coins were guarded jealously, often hidden in the walls of houses or buried in the field in case of invasions or crises, which explains why so many parables talk about hidden treasures or men calculating the cost of a tower before building it. The clothes these workers wore also tell their economic story. They didn't wear fine fabrics. Most wore tunics of heavy wool or raw linen, dyed with natural pigments extracted from plants or insects. A cloak was a man's most valuable possession. It served as a coat during the day and a blanket at night. That is why Jewish law forbade keeping someone's cloak as collateral overnight. It was a matter of basic survival. In this context, the figure of Jesus as someone who understands the world of work takes on a new dimension. When he speaks of sowing, of weeds, of talents, of workers in a vineyard, or of shrewd managers, he is using the economic software of his audience. His listeners were not armchair theologians. They were men and women with dirt under their fingernails and muscles tired from working in the quarry. They understood perfectly what it meant to owe money and the fear of being thrown in prison for an unpaid debt. The economy of Galilee was an economy of resistance. People had learned to survive in a system that extracted wealth from the periphery to send it to the center of the empire. However, amidst that pressure, there was a network of community solidarity. The concept of interest-free loans between neighbors and mutual help during the harvest was what kept society from collapsing entirely. The village looked after its own because it knew that tomorrow anyone could fall into economic misfortune. To maintain the retention of this documentary, it is vital to understand that we are not just talking about numbers or ancient coins. We are talking about human dignity at stake. Jesus' work as a craftsman gave him a unique perspective on creation and effort. He was not a leader who descended from an ivory tower. He was someone who came out of the construction workshop. That experience of being a manual laborer under an oppressive regime formed his worldview and his message about justice and the value of people above possessions. Imagine for a moment the impact of someone saying that the lilies of the field neither work nor spin and yet are better dressed than King Solomon. For a peasant who worked 14 hours a day just to barely cover his taxes, those words were not just pretty, they were revolutionary. They challenged the idea that a person's value was tied to their economic production or accumulated wealth. But daily life was not just work and money. Once the sun set and tools were put away, the center of existence shifted from the quarry and field to the family table. What did they really eat? What was that sacred moment like where bread was broken and the cup shared? That is what we are going to discover in the next section, where we will explore the diet, flavors, and rituals that turned a simple dinner into an act of faith and cultural resistance in Galilee 2,000 years ago. Have you ever wondered what the Last Supper actually tasted like, or what aroma filled the house of an ordinary family in Nazareth when the sun went down and the small clay oven was lit? Forget the royal banquets of Hollywood movies with roasted turkeys and exotic fruits that didn't exist in the region. The true cuisine of first-century Galilee was an exercise in survival, ingenuity, and a deep connection to the land that we would today call the original Mediterranean diet in its purest and roughest state. Eating in Jesus' time was not simply ingesting calories to keep working in the quarry or at the net. It was an act charged with religious symbolism, a cultural barrier against Roman influence, and the moment where the identity of an entire people was reinforced. In this section, we are going to break bread, literally, to understand how the flavors of the land shaped the message of the man who called himself the bread of life. To start, we have to talk about the absolute protagonist of the Galilean table, bread. But don't think of a crusty baguette or soft sliced bread. The bread of the time was dense, flat, and made mainly of barley or subtly ground wheat. Barley was the cereal of the poor, the one that grew in less fertile soils and filled the stomachs of most peasants. The process began long before dawn. In the shared courtyard of the insula, the rhythmic sound of millstones was the village's natural alarm. Women spent hours on their knees, moving a circular stone over a larger one to turn grain into flour. It was physically exhausting work that destroyed joints and teeth, as small fragments of stone inevitably mixed with the flour, wearing down the population's dental enamel over the years. The bread was fermented with a piece of sourdough saved from the day before, the famous leaven Jesus mentioned in his parables, and baked in a clay oven called a tanner. The smell of freshly baked bread was the scent of security. If there was bread, there was life. But bread was not eaten alone. It was used as a utensil. In a culture where forks and metal spoons did not exist for the common citizen, bread was the tool to clean the plate and scoop up the stew. And what was on that plate? The protein base was not meat, which was reserved almost exclusively for religious festivals or special sacrifices, but legumes. Lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans were the backbone of the diet. They were simmered in ceramic pots for hours, mixed with onions, garlic, and a generous amount of olive oil. Olive oil was the lubricant of life in Galilee. Not only was it the main source of healthy fats, but it was used for everything: cooking, preserving food, providing light, and anointing the body. If you walked through Nazareth in the 1st century, the air would be thick with that pungent smell of hot oil and spiced legumes. Let's talk about spices, because that's where Galilean food got interesting. Although they didn't have access to the spices from the Indies that would arrive centuries later, they used what grew on their hills: cumin, dill, mustard, coriander, and, above all, salt. Salt was the universal preservative. Without refrigeration, salt was the only thing separating a family from starvation. It was brought in large blocks from the Dead Sea and used to cure lake fish and occasional meat. When you hear the phrase, "You are the salt of the earth," you have to understand it in its economic and physical context. Salt was value, it was preservation, and it was what allowed life to continue when the seasons turned difficult. Now, let's look at the Sea of Galilee. As mentioned before, the fishing industry was vital, but fresh fish was a luxury for coastal populations. Most Galileans consumed fish processed in Magdala, salted, dried, or fermented. It was a fast and efficient meal. A piece of barley bread and a couple of dried fish was the standard lunch for a worker or traveler. It is the food a child would carry in his bag and that Jesus multiplied for the crowd. It had a strong, salty, and persistent flavor, far removed from the clean fillets of modern supermarkets. It was frequently accompanied by olives in brine, which provided the necessary bitter touch to balance the diet. And what did they drink? Water was always a risky bet. In the villages, water came from cisterns that collected rain and could often be stagnant or contaminated. Therefore, wine was the universal drink, but not as we know it today. Galilean wine was strong and thick, and was almost never drunk pure. It was mixed with 3 parts water to purify the water and make the alcohol milder. Wine was seen as a divine gift, a symbol of joy and the messianic era to come. At weddings, like the one at Cana, wine was not just a drink, it was the indicator of the family's honor. Running out of wine was a social catastrophe, a sign of poverty that would shame the hosts for years. They also drank vinegar diluted with water, a refreshing and cheap drink called pasca, which was the standard among Roman soldiers and field workers to quench thirst under the relentless sun. A fascinating aspect we often forget is religious restriction. The diet of Jesus and his contemporaries was rigidly marked by the laws of kashrut. It wasn't just about avoiding pork, which was virtually non-existent in Jewish Galilee, but about how animals were slaughtered and how foods were combined. This dietary discipline created an invisible but powerful barrier between Jew and Gentile. Sitting at the table with someone was an act of total communion. You couldn't eat with just anyone. If you shared bread with someone, you were saying that person was your equal, your brother, and that you trusted the purity of their food and their life. That is why, when Jesus' critics were scandalized because he ate with tax collectors and sinners, they weren't complaining about a simple dinner. They were accusing him of breaking the sacred boundaries of national and religious identity. Tableware also tells a story of resistance. Archaeologists have found something very curious in the houses of Galilee, a huge number of vessels made of limestone instead of ceramic. Why would someone prefer stone, which is harder to carve and heavier? The answer lies in ritual purity. According to Jewish law, if a ceramic vessel became contaminated, it had to be broken. But stone, according to the interpretation of the time, could not contract impurity. Investing in stone cups, plates, and jars was a statement of principle. We are a pure people, separated from Roman customs, and we are prepared to maintain our traditions whatever the cost. Those 6 stone water jars at the wedding in Cana weren't there for decoration. They were the family's spiritual life insurance. What was a typical midday meal like? Most people didn't sit at a table for lunch. They ate on the go, in the field, or at the construction site. Dried fruits, figs, dates, and pomegranates were the sweets of the time, providing the necessary energy for long days. Figs were especially valuable. They were dried and pressed into cakes that lasted for months and were easy to carry. When Jesus curses the fig tree that has no fruit, he is talking about a real and expected food source for any hungry traveler on the road. Dinner, on the other hand, was the moment of gathering. As the sun set, the family sat on mats around a common central dish. The light from small clay oil lamps barely illuminated the room, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and long shadows. The bread was blessed, thanking God for bringing it out of the earth, and the day's stew was shared. There were no high chairs or fine wooden tables. They reclined on the floor, especially at more formal dinners, following a custom that came from the Hellenistic world but adapted to their own culture. Conversation at the table was the children's school. There, the stories of ancestors, the laws of Moses, and the day's news were passed down. The table was the nation's educational center. It is important to note the absence of certain foods we associate with that region today. There were no tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, or citrus fruits like oranges or lemons as we know them today. The flavor palette was much more earthy and limited. The sweetness of wild honey or date syrup, the bitterness of field herbs, the acidity of vinegar and wine, and the richness of olive oil. It was honest food that didn't aim to disguise the ingredients but to highlight what the land of Galilee, with its Mediterranean climate and volcanic soils near the lake, was capable of producing. To an inhabitant of Jerusalem, the Galilean diet might have seemed rustic or even inferior, but Galileans were proud of their land's fertility. They said it was easier to raise a legion of olive trees in Galilee than a single child in Judea. This relative abundance, compared to the desert of the south, allowed hospitality to be a supreme value. If a traveler came to your door, you were bound by honor to share what you had, even if it was just a barley cake and a little water. To not do so was a stain on the entire community. To maintain retention at this point in the documentary, we must understand that every time Jesus uses a culinary image, he is hitting the nerve center of his audience's experience. When he speaks of the banquet of the kingdom, he is offering a vision of a world where no one goes hungry and the wine never runs out. For people living on the edge of malnutrition or under the pressure of not knowing if the harvest would be enough to pay taxes and feed the children, these images were incredibly powerful. Hunger was a constant reality, and food was the language of grace. The transition from food to the next topic is natural. Food was so tied to purity laws that it leads us directly to the heart of spiritual and social life. You couldn't eat without washing your hands in a specific way, not for modern hygiene, but for ritual purity. And just as the table was divided by sacred laws, a Galilean's entire life was structured by religion, education, and language. How did a child from Nazareth learn to read in a world where there were no printing presses? In what language did merchants discuss in the port? And why was a ritual bath more important than a bath for cleanliness? In the next section, we will enter the synagogue and the mind of a Galilean to discover that education was not a privilege of the few, but the glue that held a people together under occupation. We will decipher the region's trilingualism and understand how religion was not something done on Saturdays, but the air breathed in every corner of Galilee 2,000 years ago. Get ready to discover how knowledge and faith became the most effective weapons of resistance against the Roman Empire. Have you ever wondered how it's possible that a group of fishermen and craftsmen from a forgotten province of the Roman Empire managed to articulate a discourse so sophisticated that it ended up changing the course of Western history? We often have the image of Galileans as illiterate and isolated peasants, but archaeological and linguistic reality tells us a radically different story, that of a people immersed in a unique educational system, who mastered several languages and whose lives were governed by a code of purity and ritual so strict that it influenced every step they took, from the moment they woke up until they went to bed. In this section, we are going to enter the mind of a Galilee inhabitant from 2,000 years ago to understand how education, language, and religion were not separate compartments, but the connective tissue that allowed them to survive culturally before the steamroller of Roman civilization. To understand the mind of Jesus and his contemporaries, we must first break the myth of monolingualism. Galilee was not a closed ghetto, it was a hotbed of languages. The language of the heart, the one Jesus spoke with his mother and friends in the intimacy of the home, was Aramaic. But not a generic Aramaic, but a particular Galilean dialect, with a pronunciation so characteristic that, according to texts of the time, the inhabitants of Jerusalem used to mock them because they swallowed guttural letters and sounded coarse. Aramaic was the language of the street, the market, and the family. However, if that same Galilean wanted to read the scriptures or participate in formal worship, he needed Hebrew. Although Hebrew was no longer the language of common use, it remained the sacred language, the language of the law and the prophets. This means that any Jewish male with a basic education was, at the very least, functionally bilingual. But it doesn't end there. Galilee was surrounded by Greek cities and Roman garrisons. Greek was the lingua franca of commerce, administration, and international culture. If you wanted to sell your fishing nets in Tiberias or negotiate a construction contract in Sepphoris, you had to know Greek. Findings of inscriptions throughout the region show us that even in small villages, Greek was present. And finally, there was Latin, the language of military and legal power, which, although less common among the civilian population, was heard in the courts and read in official edicts. Therefore, Jesus and his disciples lived in a trilingual or even quadrilingual world. This ability to jump from one language to another gave them a mental flexibility and an openness to the world that is rarely attributed to them. Now, how was all this knowledge transmitted? This is where the synagogue comes in. Unlike the temple in Jerusalem, which was the center of national sacrifice and ritual, the local synagogue was the center of community life and, above all, the village school. In an era where in the rest of the empire education was a privilege of the elite, first-century Judaism had implemented a system that sought the religious literacy of all males. From the age of 5 or 6, children in Nazareth attended the house of the book, or Bet Sefer. There, sitting on the floor around a teacher, they learned to read and write using the sacred texts as a study manual. They didn't learn abstract mathematics or Greek philosophy, they learned the Torah. They memorized entire passages, repeated the laws over and over, and discussed their meaning. This emphasis on memory is crucial. In an oral culture, the ability to retain thousands of words with precision was a highly developed skill that we have almost completely lost today. Education did not end with learning to read. As they grew, the most capable young men moved on to the house of study, or Bet Midrash, where they delved into more complex interpretations of the law. But even for those who dedicated themselves fully to manual labor, education continued every Saturday in the synagogue. It was not a place of silent contemplation. It was a forum for debate. A passage from the Torah and another from the prophets would be read, and then any adult male who had something to contribute could stand up and explain the text. This is exactly the context in which we see Jesus beginning his public ministry, as an educated layman exercising his right to interpret the scriptures before his community. However, religion in Galilee was much more than reading parchment scrolls. It was a religion of the body and of space. For a first-century Jew, the most important distinction in life was not between good and evil, but between pure and impure. Impurity was not sin in the moral sense. It was a ritual state that prevented you from participating in sacred life. Touching a corpse, being in contact with certain bodily fluids, or simply entering a Gentile house made you impure. To remedy this, there was the mikveh, the ritual immersion bath. Archaeology has revealed that even in the humblest houses of Galilee and in the vicinity of synagogues, there were these pools carved into the rock and fed by living water, that is, naturally flowing water. The fact that poor families invested so much effort and space in building a mikveh tells us that ritual purity was an absolute priority, a way of marking spiritual territory against pagan occupation. This obsession with purity extended to everyday objects. As mentioned before, the use of stone vessels instead of ceramic was a ritual security measure. Stone did not become contaminated. Imagine the mental discipline necessary to live like this. Every object you touch, every person you talk to, and every food you ingest must pass through the filter of the law. For a Galilean, This was not a heavy burden, but a point of pride. It was what reminded them that they were God's chosen people, even while Roman soldiers patrolled their streets. Religion was their cultural armor. But it wasn't all harmony. There was a constant tension between the popular piety of Galilee and the religious hierarchy of Jerusalem. Galileans were often seen by the Judean elite as passionate but ignorant of the finer details of the oral law. They were considered a bit rebellious, a bit impetuous. This characterization is vital to understanding why messianic and revolutionary movements often started in Galilee. Religious fervor there was mixed with a strong sense of social justice. They expected the Messiah not only as a spiritual figure, but as a real liberator who would restore the kingdom of Israel and end the economic oppression of Rome and its collaborators. Prayer marked the rhythm of the day. A Galilean recited the Shema Israel upon waking and going to sleep. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." These words were not a simple formula. They were a declaration of political and spiritual loyalty. In a world full of statues of emperors calling themselves sons of gods, asserting that there was only one God was an act of resistance. Prayers were made facing Jerusalem, physically connecting the village with the temple, the place where the divine presence was believed to reside on earth. And what about women? Although formal education in the synagogue was centered on males, Galilean women were not religiously ignorant. They were the guardians of the home's purity. They were in charge of maintaining dietary laws and transmitting oral traditions, songs, and domestic prayers to the children. Their piety was manifested in the fulfillment of ritual cycles and in the management of community charity. The influence of mothers in the spiritual formation of figures like Jesus was immense, based on a practical and resilient faith. Another fundamental element was the calendar. Time was not linear or secular, it was cyclic and sacred. The Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, was a radical interruption of the economy of exploitation. For 24 hours, the slave was equal to the master, the ox rested, and no one worked. It was a weekly preview of ultimate freedom. In addition to the Sabbath, the three great pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, forced Galileans to leave their nets and workshops to travel to Jerusalem. These trips were epic. They walked for days in large groups, singing psalms and reinforcing national bonds. Upon arriving in the holy city and seeing the radiant temple, their identity was reaffirmed. However, returning to the simplicity of Galilee, the contrast with the luxury of the priestly aristocracy often fueled their desire for profound change. Literacy in Galilee also had a magical and popular side. There was a firm belief in the power of words and names. Children's names were not chosen for aesthetics, but for meaning and lineage. Naming a son Yeshua, Jesus, or Yehuda, Judas, was invoking Israel's history of salvation. Additionally, there was a rich tradition of folk wisdom, proverbs, and parables passed down from generation to generation. Jesus did not invent the method of parables. He brought it to its maximum expression using a pedagogical tool that was already common in Galilean culture to explain complex concepts through everyday images. To maintain the retention of this video, we must realize that Jesus' religion was not something that happened only inside a building. It was something that happened in the field, at the well, and on the road. Galileans saw God's hand in the early and late rains, in the health of the livestock, and in the net full of fish. There was no clear distinction between the sacred and the profane. The whole cosmos was permeated by the divine presence. This worldview made any social or political injustice seen as a direct affront to God. That is why Jesus' message about the kingdom of God was not heard as a proposal for the hereafter, but as an urgent intervention in the here and now of Galilee. In summary, the section on education and religion shows us an extremely resilient people. Despite being under the boot of one of history's most formidable superpowers, the Galileans did not assimilate. They kept their languages, protected their schools, immersed themselves in their ritual baths, and continued to debate their sacred texts with a passion that astonished their contemporaries. They were not passive victims of history. They were active participants in a vibrant culture that used knowledge as its primary form of freedom. But this faith and education did not exist in a vacuum. They were lived within a family and social structure that was the true support of daily life. How were families organized so that no one was left behind? What was the actual role of women in a society often presented to us as strictly patriarchal? And how did they face sickness and old age in a world without hospitals? In the next section, we are going to explore the social fabric of Galilee, analyzing clothing, health, and family hierarchies to complete the portrait of these people who, 2,000 years ago, dreamed of a transformed world. Have you ever wondered if the structure of Jesus's family resembled the modern nuclear family of dad, mom, and kids living under one independent roof, or if his world was actually a social network so dense and complex that privacy was a virtually non-existent concept? If today we value our independence and personal space above almost everything, in the Galilee of 2,000 years ago, that same independence would have been seen as a death sentence or, at least, as a sign of absolute disgrace. In this section, we are going to untangle the DNA of Galilean society, from the real and powerful role of women in the domestic economy to the codes of honor that could raise a family to public respect or condemn it to the most severe ostracism, moving through the raw reality of health and clothing in a world where your appearance told exactly who you were before you even opened your mouth. To begin understanding the social structure of Galilee, we have to erase the image of the single-family home. The center of everything was the paternal house or betub. Imagine a complex of rooms that were added as male sons married. When a son took a wife, he didn't move to another city. He built an additional room connected to the central courtyard of his father's house. This created a micro-community of 3 or 4 generations living in just a few square meters. The patriarch, the grandfather or great-grandfather, was the maximum authority, but his power was not a tyranny, but a responsibility of protection. In this environment, children were not raised only by their parents, but by a network of aunts, grandparents, and cousins. A girl's education in household tasks or a boy's in the family trade was an organic and constant process. If you got sick, you didn't look for a hospital. You had 10 relatives ready to care for you. If you lacked food, the extended family's granary was your life insurance. But let's get into a topic often surrounded by myths: the role of women. The first-century woman is often presented as an invisible and oppressed figure, but archaeology and texts show us a much more dynamic reality. While it is true that public space and politics were dominated by men, the woman was the absolute manager of the home, which at that time was the most important economic production unit. The Galilean woman did not just cook, she was a textile expert, a resource administrator, and often a key player in local trade. She spun wool, wove tunics, and sold the surplus at the market. The family's survival depended on her ability to manage the budget and provisions. Furthermore, in the context of Jesus's movement, we see something revolutionary. Women who not only listened but financed his ministry and traveled with a group, something that broke the social patterns of the time and indicates that the social fabric was more flexible than we usually believe. Let's talk now about what these people looked like. Clothing in Galilee was not a matter of fashion, but of identity and status. The basic garment for men and women was the tunic, a kind of long shirt made of linen or wool. Over it, men wore the cloak or tallit. This cloak was sacred. According to the law of Moses, it had to have fringes on the 4 corners, called tzitzit, with a blue thread that reminded them of God's commandments. To see a man walking through Nazareth was to see his spiritual resume hanging from his clothes. Women also wore long tunics, often with embroidery that indicated their geographic origin or social status, and covered their hair with veils or cloths when going out into public space, not necessarily as a sign of submission, but as a mark of honor and modesty that protected them from the scrutiny of strangers. Colors were earthy, ochres, browns, and the raw white of wool, as expensive dyes like Tyrian purple were reserved for the elite of Roman cities. The concept of honor and shame is, perhaps, the most important key to understanding why people behaved the way they did. In our modern society, success is measured by money. In Galilee, it was measured by honor. Honor was a person's value in the eyes of their community. If a man could not protect his family, or if a woman broke the norms of modesty, the honor of the entire lineage collapsed. This explains why the disputes in the Gospels seem so intense. They weren't fighting over opinions, they were fighting over their public reputation, which was the only thing they had. That is why Jesus's gesture of sitting to eat with public sinners was so explosive. He wasn't just being kind, he was transferring his own honor to people whom society had marked with absolute shame. He was hacking the social system from the inside. But social life also had a very dark side: illness and disability. In a world without antibiotics, without anesthesia, and with a limited understanding of biological hygiene, any small wound could be fatal. Average life expectancy hovered around 30 or 40 years, although if you managed to survive childhood, you had a chance of reaching old age. Skin diseases, eye infections causing blindness, and malaria in the low areas near the lake were common. However, the greatest weight of illness was not physical pain, but social stigma. Many diseases were seen as ritual impurity or even divine punishment. A leper, for example, did not just suffer from the degeneration of his tissues. He suffered social death, being expelled from the village and forced to live in caves or cemeteries. Medicine of the time was a mixture of traditional herbalism, use of oils, and prayers. Doctors existed, but as the story of the woman with the flow of blood says, they often charged a lot and helped little. Health was a luxury that few could maintain. The social structure was also divided by purity of lineage. Being a pure-blooded Israelite, able to trace your genealogy back to one of the ancient tribes, gave you a superior status compared to converts or Samaritans. Galilee was a place of mixing, and Jews from Jerusalem sometimes looked at Galileans with suspicion, doubting the purity of their ancestors due to the region's history of invasions. This regional tension marked daily interactions. A Galilean felt like a first-class Jew, proud of his resistance against the Greeks and Romans, but often felt looked down upon by the capital's aristocracy. And what happened with the elderly and children? Children were seen as a blessing, but also as a future workforce. Infant mortality was extremely high, so the arrival of a male son was celebrated with music and banquets, as it ensured the continuity of the name and the mother's protection in case of widowhood. The elderly, for their part, were the storehouses of wisdom. In a culture that did not depend on books for learning, the elder's memory was the village library. When an elder spoke at the city gate or in the house courtyard, the young listened. The concept of retirement did not exist. One worked as long as the body held up and then became the counselor and judge of family matters. Hospitality was the glue that bound strangers. In a world of dangerous roads and no hotels, receiving a traveler was a sacred duty. A guest was offered water to wash their feet, oil for their head, and the best food available. To deny hospitality was a stain of shame for the entire village. This network of hospitality was precisely what allowed religious movements and ideas to spread so quickly throughout Galilee. Jesus sent his disciples out 2 by 2 without money, trusting fully in the social structure of welcome that was engraved in every Galilean's DNA. To maintain retention at this point in the video, we must realize that social life in Galilee was a constant struggle for balance. A balance between the individual and the group, between purity and contact with the world, between family honor and Rome's economic pressures. They were not isolated individuals pursuing personal dreams. They were knots in a very tight net. Every decision a young person in Nazareth made affected their cousins, their neighbors, and their father's reputation in the synagogue. This social pressure is what makes Jesus' message so disruptive. When he says that his true brothers and sisters are those who do the will of God, he is breaking the most sacred bond of society, the betub, the paternal house. He was proposing a new social structure based on faith and not on blood, something that to a traditional Galilean sounded almost as radical as a declaration of war. Family life ended with the rituals of death. Burials were performed the same day as death due to the heat. The family gathered to mourn, professional mourners were hired, and the body was placed in family caves carved into the rock. Even in death, the Galilean wanted to be with his ancestors, waiting for the resurrection that many believed would come at the end of time. This sense of continuity, of being part of a chain extending from Abraham to the present, was what gave them the strength to endure Roman occupation and the hardships of daily life. Understanding the social and family structure of Galilee allows us to see Jesus not as a character in a fairy tale, but as a man who grew up in a network of real affections, obligations, and tensions. His message about love for one's neighbor, forgiveness, and community did not emerge from a vacuum, but from his daily experience in the courtyards of Nazareth and in the squares of neighboring villages. But after analyzing how they lived, how they ate, how they worked, and how they organized themselves, one final question remains. How is it possible that all these everyday elements came together to form a message that has lasted 2 millennia? In the conclusion of this documentary, we are going to see how the seeds, the fishing nets, and the coins we have talked about became the universal language of a new faith. We are going to travel to the present to see what remains of that Galilee and how archaeological findings continue to shout the truth about the life of history's most influential man. Is it possible that the key to understanding history's greatest mystery is found not in grand theological dogmas, but in the dust of the roads, in the smell of salted fish, and in the roughness of the limestone we have explored throughout this journey? After traversing the markets, entering mud brick houses, and sitting at the table with the inhabitants of Galilee 2,000 years ago, we reach the point where all these puzzle pieces fit together to reveal something astonishing. Jesus did not speak in abstract riddles for philosophers. He spoke the language of daily survival. Every time he opened his mouth to teach, He used his listeners' mental software. Men and women whose primary concerns were paying taxes, their children's health, and the hope that the next fishing trip would be enough to cover debts. In this conclusion, we will see how that everyday world became an eternal legacy and why, despite the passing of centuries, the echo of Galilee still resonates so strongly in our present. The first thing we must understand is that Jesus' message was a communication success precisely because it was anchored in the physical reality we have described. When he spoke of a lost sheep, his audience did not see a tender metaphor. They saw the loss of vital capital for a family living on the edge of subsistence. When he spoke of the lilies of the field that neither work nor spin, he was directly addressing women who spent 10 hours a day hunched over a loom to clothe their children. The genius of his teaching lay in taking the most mundane elements of Galilean life and charging them with transcendent meaning. You didn't need to be a scholar in Jerusalem to understand the kingdom of God. You only needed to have seen a woman put leaven in dough or a sower scatter grain in a rocky field. That bridge between the sacred and the everyday is what allowed his message to leap across Galilee's borders and become universal. But what remains of that world today? If you travel to modern Galilee, you will find a landscape that still bears the scars and treasures of that first century. Thanks to modern archaeology, we have moved from assumptions to evidence. The discovery of the Magdala boat in the lake's mud showed us exactly what the vessels were like in which Peter and Andrew sailed. Excavations in Nazareth have revealed houses that perfectly match the description of the insuli we analyzed, reminding us that Jesus was not born in a vacuum, but in an environment of community and physical closeness. These findings not only validate historical accounts but humanize them. They tell us that these people were real, that their struggles for bread and honor were real, and that the environment in which they grew was the crucible that forged a new way of understanding divinity. The impact of the Galilean environment on early Christianity is incalculable. The cultural resistance against Rome, that refusal to assimilate that we saw in their ritual baths and stone tableware, was transformed into a spiritual resistance that ended up conquering the very empire that oppressed them. The hospitality network that allowed travelers to sleep in the homes of strangers was the infrastructure used by the first disciples to take their ideas to the ends of the known world. Without the social structure of the Betub and the solidarity of Galilean villages, the movement started by Jesus would hardly have survived his leader's execution. It was the strength of those family and community bonds that kept the spark alive in the darkest moments. For you, who have accompanied this documentary to this point, the lesson is clear. To understand any historical figure, and especially one of Jesus' magnitude, we cannot divorce them from their context. Daily life 2,000 years ago is not just a backdrop, it is the very language in which history was written. By understanding how they dressed, what they ate, and under what economic pressures they lived, we stop seeing biblical characters as distant marble figures and begin to see them as what they were: workers, craftsmen, mothers, and fishermen seeking meaning in a difficult and often unjust world. The Galilee of Jesus was a place of brutal contrasts, a point of clash between the glory of Rome and the unshakable faith of a small people. And it is precisely in that clash where something new emerged. The daily life of a Galilean teaches us that the extraordinary is usually hidden in the ordinary. Not in the marble palaces of Sepphoris, but in the humble houses of Nazareth. Not in Herod's banquets, but in the bread shared at the lakeshore. That is the true legacy of Galilee. The idea that common, ordinary life has infinite value and that humanity's greatest changes often begin with a small group of people in a forgotten province who decide to live in a different way. Today, when we look at the ruins of synagogues or walk along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, we are not just looking at dead stones. We are looking at the foundations of our own culture. Every time we value manual labor, every time we defend the dignity of the oppressed, or every time we share a meal with a sense of community, we are repeating gestures that were perfected on those hills 2 millennia ago. The history of daily life in Galilee is, ultimately, our own story, the chronicle of how humanity attempts to connect with the divine through the simplest things. We hope this journey through time has allowed you to see the biblical world with new eyes, far from the filters of fiction and closer to the real heartbeat of history. The next time you hear one of those ancient stories, perhaps you can smell the olive oil, feel the weight of the cloak on your shoulders, and hear the bustle of the Magdala market. Because it is there, in the small details, where the truth truly lives. Has it surprised you to discover that Jesus' world was much more complex and connected than you imagined? If you want to continue delving into the real history behind humanity's great myths and discover how archaeology continues to change what we know about our past, don't forget to subscribe and check our upcoming documentaries where we will continue exploring the best-kept secrets of antiquity. Would you like us to delve now into what life was like in the great city of Jerusalem during the pilgrimage festivals?